So we
I
are live.
I think we are live. It says we're live.
Okay, I've got a button at the bottom that says go live, but I will assume that we are live if you're telling me people are coming in. Maybe. Okay. All right.
Yeah,
Well, welcome.
Jean Doral is here. Okay, I'll shut up.
No, uh, hello, everyone. Welcome. Great to see you. If you don't know me, I'm Annelise Riles, and I have the Substack Everyday Ambassador, where we think about the role that each of us can play in peace and peace building, broadly conceived. And I am just thrilled to be here today with Aimee Liu. This is the first time I've had a chance to talk with you, Aimee, in person, but I feel like I know you because I've been following your work really closely over the last year and just have been so inspired by so many things, little and big, that you have shared with this community. And most recently, just had the incredible pleasure of reading your fabulous latest novel, Glorious Boys, which I'm really excited about this. So welcome, Aimee. Maybe if you could tell everyone a little bit about your Substack, that would be great.
Sure. Mine is MFA Lore, and it is basically, I describe it as the essence of an MFA in creative writing minus the tuition. I taught in an MFA program for 15 years or so, and then the college closed, like so many colleges have, and I really missed it. And so I thought, well, I had been on Substack for about a year at that point, posting a variety of other stuff, pieces about my family, memoir pieces. But I decided to just dedicate the whole thing to different aspects of what you would get from an MFA program. So that's what I do over there.
And it's amazing. I mean, for folks who haven't read Aimee's writing about writing, I have just found it. I don't consider myself a writer. I consider myself a person who's thinking and trying to share ideas. And even in my little skill set, I've learned so much from you just about how to structure a story and just many really thoughtful ways of deepening the craft. So just so grateful for everything you do there. But I mean, the reason we wanted to talk today is because I think we're both really interested in our wider lives in the question of democracy and peace and what's happening in our world. And we also have a strong shared interest in the Asia Pacific region, what's happening in that region. And Aimee, maybe we could start with your book, because your novel, Glorious Boy, is set during World War II, before the war, during the war, and after the war. And I think it just gives us so much perspective on what the experience, the reality of war is, the human reality of war, how it impacts. Because this is a book about a family, right? A family that is torn apart by the experience of war. So maybe could you just share a little bit about what the book is about and some of the characters so that folks can get a sense of what it's about?
Sure. Well, it opens in the late 1930s with a young woman who's a budding kind of a wannabe anthropologist, and she has studied some, but she doesn't really have a strong sense. And then she happens to meet this British doctor who is on his way to the Andaman Islands, which is one of the most interesting places on the planet. And as you know, Annalise, since you're an anthropologist, it's a place where the preeminent anthropologist Radcliffe Brown did some field work. And so Claire knows about that. She sees her opportunity to go and do her own field work as the young bride of this doctor. So they go off to the Andaman Islands, and she gets pregnant before she imagines that she would. And so she's sort of thrust into motherhood at the same time that she's trying to get out and do this field work and making it all up kind of on her own. And so their child turns out to be a strange child. he doesn't speak, and so he's 4 years old, not speaking when war breaks out, and the Japanese are poised to invade the Andaman Islands, and they have to evacuate. And uh, when they are leaving, the young girl who takes care of Ty, the little boy, realizes they're not going to take her with them because she's a local girl and she's very jealous and very protective. She's an orphan, and she hides with Ty, and that leaves Claire and Shep to evacuate without their child. And Shep basically forces his wife onto the last ship that's going out, and he stays behind to find Ty. And then the Japanese invade. So all kinds of things happen after that, but that's sort of the setup to the story. It's partly, the strain that having a child who's different can place on a family, on communication. The book is really a lot of it. The sort of central thread is kind of the silent language, or the many silent languages that we speak, because the local tribe have their own silent language, and the children have their own silent language, and the parents have their own silent language, and the inability to communicate with through all the silence is a big part of what the story is all about, with war
So
thrown into the middle of it.
thrown into the middle of it. And I mean, it's so interesting because before the war breaks out in this book, there are so many divisions, right? I mean, Claire and her husband think that the other colonials are all, racist, horrible people,
Right.
and they kind of dehumanize them. But then, then we have like the way they themselves dehumanize the tribes that they are supposedly
Mhm.
studying with great interest, and the girl who takes care. I mean, so there's all these layers of the ways in which we create borders between ourselves,
Right.
and then you thrust onto that war itself. And I mean, that's sort of something I wanted to ask you about. I mean, having lived with this war through your characters, I mean, what did you learn about how how to think about humanizing other people, and how to think about the importance of humanizing people, um, as as a way of building peace? What do you think?
I think it's absolutely essential. I think, we've talked a lot, you and I, about the power of literature and the role of literature in peace building. And I think one of the roles that literature plays is that it does humanize everybody in the story. It creates empathy, it creates compassion, and it brings something that is as huge as a global war down to the human level, the individual level. The writer Jim Shepard calls the worm's eye view of history, and you call it slicing as a tool in diplomacy. But I think that when we were talking about putting this together, I started thinking about the role of tropes, in language, in communication, and how we're currently in a world run by this regime that turns everything into a negative trope, and a trope that's a divisive trope. Everybody who's not white and not Republican and not MAGA Republican is basically some form of an alien. And
Yep,
the word, the trope alien, is just
yep.
so incredibly loaded because it means inhuman. Um, and that kind of, those loaded tropes have a power that's way beyond anything. And so the power of literature is to kind of, use alternative tropes, really, the tropes of humanity and the tropes of connection and the tropes of understanding, which is really what literature is all about. So, I mean, I think when we talk about language, we talk about literature, we talk about storytelling. Storytelling, of course, can be used for propagandistic purposes, just as tropes can be, but they're used that way because they're so powerful. So that same power can be harnessed and used for good, and used to bring people together, and used to enlighten and connect people. And so that's kind of what we're playing with here. And it's interesting to look at those different kinds of stories, because the stories that are used for propagandistic purposes tend to be very simplistic, black and white, you
Yes.
know.
Yes.
And the stories that we consider to be literature are much more nuanced. They're much more complex.
Yeah.
They're not simplistic at all. And they get down through all of those surface layers, whereas propaganda really just sits right on the top layer of what people see right in front of their heads without, thinking anything further. Good, bad, right, wrong, all that kind of stuff. So,
Yeah. I mean, you make the points, directly in words in the book, but you also make it through the storyline so many times. I mean, again and again, the characters that save the day are precisely the ones that everyone thought were the duplicitous, untrustworthy, racist ones, right? So we have a sense in the book, I think, of, boy, I misjudged that person. Boy, I assumed that about them, but
yeah,
boy, I didn't see that coming,
yeah,
and and meanwhile, also some of the folks that we think of as really amazing, turn out to have sometimes a selfish side to themselves, sometimes multiple lines of interest, a kind of coldness. So that was really powerful for me. And as you say, it's that gray that you create that just makes the characters so meaningful. I have to say, I told you before we started, I really somehow just identified so much with this book because I had a life very much like your character much earlier in my own life, in
yeah.
Fiji when I first started my field work. And so I know a little bit about what you're describing and the world that you're describing. Uh, yeah, it's very meaningful. I was thinking about uh, sharing this book with people in Nagasaki, where I am doing my work now, because they have a really strong view about what the world needs now, which I think is really hard for international lawyers to grasp. Like, I think most people want them to stand for we should get rid of nuclear weapons, which, they want to say they were the last place on earth to be bombed. They want no one else to ever experience this again, et cetera, et cetera. But they really resist that. And people who are survivors always say to me, well, if it weren't nuclear weapons, human beings would invent the next horrible thing to do to each other, and it would be some other thing, so it's good to get rid of nuclear weapons, but that's not going to solve the problem. The problem is that we dehumanize each other, right? And that
Yeah.
you can't drop a nuclear weapon on someone if you think of them as human beings. You can't. The first step to war is to dehumanize someone. I was
Mhm.
watching CNN this morning. It's morning here in Japan. On CNN this morning, the bombing of Iran that we're engaged in right now, in the midst of people mourning for having lost their leaders.
Mhm.
And I was thinking, there are many things we could say about this, but it's something you cannot do if you imagine these people as human beings, right? And so really, I think your point about the importance of literature is not a small point at all. It's a big point, because all of this war stuff is impossible, is neutralized
Mhm.
if people absolutely are capable of seeing other people as not human, right?
Yeah,
And so this is the work that your folks can do that
yeah.
actually saves the world. And I'm not like that is not an exaggeration. This saves the world.
Well, it's a nice thought. We try. But I mean, it's certainly basic to the whole, problem with indigenous peoples. Um, and genocide always is based on the premise that you view your targets as ants, not as human beings. And that allows you to exterminate the ants.
Yes.
And all the language goes in that direction of dehumanizing. And as an Asian American, of course, God, we've got a long history of that. I mean, the the museums are full of images of Chinese Americans as, dragons or ants or reptiles or lizards or monkeys or, whatever, anything but human. So, yeah, it's very powerful. And getting back to the story in Glorious Boy, one of the things that I loved is that character, the character who saves the day, who appears to be a low life drunkard, just this side of an animal, is an actual historical character. And he actually did work for the British. He was a spy. He did all of the things that are in the book. And that there were so many people like that. All of these forest tribes that both the colonialist British and the Japanese, they both looked at them as just animals in the jungle, basically just write them off, dismiss them, exterminate them if you have to, or ignore them or whatever. But and they were heroes, and they did get awarded, medals by the British at the end of the war. Quite something. So yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And putting aside what they did for the British in your story, they welcome a little boy who has nowhere to go, and
Yeah.
care. And
Yeah.
I think that's something, I've seen in Pacific cultures a lot, is that the capacity to welcome people and to, that just the there's an openness there that's it's almost like I feel as a Euro American that I'm missing a certain sense, like I'm missing a
Mm.
DNA slice that they have when it comes to being
Yeah.
able to just kind of open your heart and take somebody in. But it's complicated, and your story, it's complicated, right? It's complicated for them. It's not easy. So
Yeah.
you
Yeah. I
make that.
think that actually the hardest thing
Yeah.
that I struggled with in the book was how to extend this sense of understanding to the Japanese characters in the book. Because they are so different. They were in this area as spies, heavily as spies before the war. So it's, even the people that they got to know each other a little bit, but they were deceived, they were deceiving the people around them. So I really found it necessary to look at the individual soldiers, and talk about, really think about humanizing them in the moment, so that it's in Claire's mind that when she's watching these people from afar, she's seeing them in their human interactions rather than just as soldiers, just as the enemy, just as that. And that's hard when you're in the
Yeah.
middle of a war, to do that, to try and peel back those layers and see the humanity underneath,
Yes.
is very, very difficult, but I think it's more important than ever. Then there's that famous story from World War II in Europe, where at Christmas in World War One in Europe, where at Christmas they came out of the foxholes and trenches, and the British and the Germans that celebrated Christmas together, and then they went back and started killing each other the next day. I mean, I you see something like that and you think, how is that possible? Something that's so promising and hopeful, but I think it boils down to sort of the maybe the limitation of what we're talking about here, which is that individual people on the ground can make these connections and do this work and do this understanding. But if they are still answering to powers above that only are dealing in black and white and enemy and ally and all of that, and are giving those kinds of orders, I mean, that's the real challenge. Is you can do this work at the ground level, but it's got to percolate up. It's got to go all the way to the top somehow. And and top down. I mean, it has to go in both directions. It's a little bit like what's been happening with corporate culture, or was happening in corporate culture until this current change. But I've done some work with the former Surgeon General Vivek Murthy, and he was very, very involved in changing corporate culture to have more understanding, more joint problem solving, more diplomacy, if you will, in that. And I think that that's um, stories like this can be useful, at every level of that process too. But it has to get to every level is the challenge.
Yeah. Yeah. I think what is powerful to me about your book is that it holds the light and the dark together in the same, like, so without giving away too much, you have an absolutely searing and unforgettable scene of a beheading from the point of view of the person who's beheaded. It's like nothing I've ever read. It's unbelievable. And um it's not the Hollywood version. It's the what it feels like to the person version. And I appreciated that so much because what you're asking us to do is to really come to terms with what a human rights violation is like from the point of view of the person who's violated, to really put ourselves in the body and the mind of that person, and to judge that this is absolutely unacceptable and wrong, while at the same
Mhm.
time asking us to think about the fact that the people who we see as monsters are not monsters. How does someone, I mean, to me, that's where we get to wisdom and almost like spirituality. Like, how do you hold these two things in one space?
Yeah.
It's really tough. And I don't think law is very good at that. But literature perhaps gives us a handle. I don't know.
Yeah, law is problematic because after the war, um, they did prosecute a couple of guys for these are based on real executions, and they did prosecute a couple of guys, but of course they didn't prosecute the guy at the top. They didn't prosecute the guy who actually committed the act or ordered the act. It was, and that's where the humanity comes in for the supposed enemy, because so many people on the other side are suffering just as much. They're feeling just as helpless, they're feeling just as powerless, they're feeling just as wronged. I there's a new book. Won't get into too many of the details, but I was involved in it. A new book called Moral Injuries,
Yes.
that's just come out,
Yes.
and it's
Yeah.
all about what we're talking about. And when I first got into that, I was really amazed by this idea of the damage that's done when a traumatic act, a major violation is committed. The damage is almost equal on both sides.
Yes. That's right. That's
The
right. There was a
perpetrator and the victim are both damaged in incalculable moral ways.
yes.
So, yeah.
Yes. And we had I was so glad you were able to join us at our Everyday Ambassador Salon this month, and we had a colleague from Argentina who was talking about the aftermath of what's happened in Argentina, with the
Mm.
end of the violence there, 1982, and they're still dealing with this today, right? They're
Wow.
still
Yeah.
trying to come to terms with the moral injuries and the fact that everybody knew but didn't know, but didn't say, but didn't, and everyone is complicitous in some way. And what this really brought home to me is, I mean, coming back to the US case and what you and I care about what's happening in our
Mhm.
country,
Yeah.
is how long it's going to take to come to terms with the violence that you're describing, the moral injury that we've all been made somehow complicitous to,
Mhm.
right? Through this
Yeah.
process, right? Or, it's not going to be like, we need to realize it's not going to be like tomorrow this thing is done and
Yeah.
elections change and we get over it. We're going to need
Right.
a lot of stories, a lot of your stories to sort of help
Yeah.
us to process this, right?
Yeah.
Probably.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's so much denial that goes on. It's just incredible. Um, yeah.
So, yeah, so I mean, one of the things, I mean, I think one of the reasons I love the work that you're doing on the Asia Pacific region and the war and colonialism is that I think that um, we're now getting to a point where the generation that knew those things firsthand is passing, And we don't have that experience ourselves anymore, right?
Mm,
Our parents did. They
yeah.
they knew, they often didn't talk about it a lot, right?
Mhm.
They had
Mhm.
that experience, but we now have a generation of folks who don't have that firsthand experience of course, many people in the world do, let's be honest, do
Yeah.
have a lot of that
Yeah.
experience, but some of us don't. What do you think about that? I mean, do you think that there's a role for fiction there in kind of maybe making us come to terms with what is really at stake here?
I think one of the benefits of fiction is that it can reach people who otherwise aren't thinking about it. I think that for the writers, like, and a great many of the people who write these kinds of books are the grandchildren of people who lived through horrific acts, and whose parents then, as you say, went quiet. People like my neighbor across the street is the granddaughter of Japanese internment camp people, and her parents, that generation that lived in the camps that came
Yeah,
right after, just nothing. A lot of new immigrants. My father immigrated when he to America when he was 19, and because of the McCarthy period, he never said one word about any of that. I had to pry out of him what I could. So, it's the grandchild's generation that is hopefully interested and feels safe enough that they don't have the hangups or the fears that shroud it all in mystery. So they want to open up and solve the mystery. That's certainly how I felt. And then if you're writing fiction and you write the book, like the story of my grandparents, I wrote as a family saga. And it went out and reached people who didn't even know that there was a Chinese republic. They didn't know anything about the warlord era. They didn't know anything about mixed race marriage in the early 1900s. They were just looking for a good, romantic read, basically. And so they got an education. And I think that's certainly one of the benefits of literature is that
yes,
it can do that and forces people to imagine themselves
yes.
in the role of people who are living through really difficult
Yeah,
times.
yeah, yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And I suppose it also has an impact on the writer. I mean, one of the things about anthropology that um, young anthropologists like your character Claire have to discover, and she does discover in your book, is that you think you're collecting data. That's what you think you're doing. You think you're going there to find out the facts, but what you're
Mhm.
really doing is changing yourself, right? Like,
Yeah.
yeah, and allowing yourself to be changed. And I always say to my doctoral students, come back when you've given up the question. Like, I don't want answers to the
Mm.
question you started with. I want the point at which you've decided the question was the wrong question,
Uh,
and then we'll talk, and because there always is that point, right? That you realize that they've changed, the encounter has changed you in some way, right? And
yeah.
I wonder, do you have that relationship with your characters? I mean, do you feel like they change you too, or not so much? What would
Oh
you say?
yeah. Yeah. I mean, I never know who they're going to be at the end. And sometimes um, sometimes they please me. I mean, I think Claire came out okay in the end. I think she had a lot of raw edges in the beginning. I had another character who was the main character of my book Flash House, which was a War novel, and she just, as my husband described her, she was like a bull in the china shop, and she created a lot of unintended damage by the end of that book. And she wasn't all bad, but she certainly was, a mixed bag.
That's
So,
interesting.
but I think
That's
this book in particular did change me. I mean, I there were a lot of things that I knew when I started the book that um they opened up and took root in unexpected ways by the end. You can't go through that experience of everything that you've that even that you've been touching on, because you have to write it, you have to inhabit the characters, you have to be in that moment, you have to experience the horror, and the struggle. Um, One of the things that happens in the book that I really did wrestle with, and I thought about how many millions of people have this experience. The war is raging, and Claire's one little 4-year-old has been left behind, and she wants the entire world to stand on its head so that she can get back there and rescue him.
Yeah.
And you're thinking, there's a war on, lady. Nobody is going to stop the world so you can go look for your kid.
And
But
yet and
that
yet nothing else matters in the end. I mean,
exactly.
that is what changes things, right? That
Yeah.
in one person caring about one other person is all that there is in the end.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, that was sort of, back to your point of earlier about, sometimes human to human relationships are fine, but when we get in these institutions or it gets abstracted up, there are so many stories in my field of nuclear disarmament where um, it comes down to one person. It
Yeah.
comes down to, people don't realize how many times we've averted nuclear war by accident just because of one person. One person who, for some reason, thought, this can't be right. We can't be in the middle of an attack. This can't really be happening. I'm just going to risk it. I'm going to risk everything and say, no, I'm not going to do what I'm supposed to do.
Yeah.
Or one person who has one scientist in Princeton who has a relationship with one scientist in Moscow and says, I'm just going to call that person and see if we can work something out between the two of us, right? And just these relationships, these very human one-to-one decisions, one-to-one relationships that end up literally saving the world,
And that's exactly what's so terrifying about this current regime is that
Yeah,
they want to get rid of all those
yeah,
relationships. They want to
yes,
get rid of anybody that's got a moral compass. They want to get rid of anybody who's a critical thinker.
yes,
Then
yes,
anybody who will doubt them, anything that
yes,
they say, who will, and
yes,
that's so, I mean, all of civilization is based on the kinds of relationships and the kind of integrity that you're talking about. And
yeah.
these people intentionally want to get rid of all of it.
Absolutely. 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 And it's funny, Amy. I mean, I see it in the university. For years, I directed before I was in charge of global affairs at Northwestern. I was in charge of Asian studies at Cornell, and um, you know, I spent a lot of my career working with China. I spent a lot of my career, inviting Chinese scholars and working with China. I speak Chinese. So I was like doing a lot of, and there was every professor 20 years ago had a Chinese collaborator or a friend
Mm,
or someone that
mm,
they invited,
mhm.
or it was just there was the contact back and forth, the scientific contact was just so vibrant. It's like nothing now. Like there's nobody's in touch. Nobody, it's just both sides, both governments have stopped this relationship. And,
Yeah.
I just think, you know, if as individual scholars, we could just restart one or two of those relationships, each of us, this would
Mhm.
do a lot to sort of neutralize the kind of policy level project that you described. That is
Yeah.
it's a project of dehumanizing the other, so that when the time comes, we can go fight them and think that they're not human beings because we don't know any of them,
Right.
right?
Right. Right.
But when you say, no, 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 I have a friend in Beijing. I have a friend in Beijing, and I know that person. That person's not crazy. Like that, they can't believe, you know what I mean? So that's when it starts to break down for them. So they got to stop us from doing that. And it's a form of resistance, I think, for
Yeah,
us.
it is, but they're doing it by saying the fact that you have a friend in Beijing makes you the enemy. So then that's the chilling effect on all of that. Yeah, it's
Absolutely. Absolutely.
horrific.
Well, I mean, so one of the things I'm really interested in about you is that in recent years, in addition to all the work you've been doing teaching writing, you've really kind of been taking a more activist position on these issues in your life and now on Substack. And I mean, can you talk a little bit about that decision to do that and how that is changing the way you see your work and what
Well,
you've that?
yeah. I mean, so I forgot to mention that my other Substack is Authors for Democracy, which is what you're talking about. And I really, that is mostly just an aggregator of pieces that are across Substack on messaging for democracy, basically. It was when we started it, I had a group of people that sort of helped me brainstorm what we wanted to do with Authors for Democracy because it started on Facebook, I guess, trying to get Kamala Harris elected. And so after that, it needed to be kind of reshaped or reformed or something. And so we decided that there's just too much writing generally. Authors are writing about democracy all the time. That's just a hodgepodge. So we boiled it down to being a very useful Substack where writers who want to write about democracy can come and get messaging
Oh, interesting.
information and, what to say, how to say it, how to tell a story that is pro democracy, where you don't fall into some of the traps of language that end up feeding the other side. So
Interesting.
that's what that ended up being.
Wait, can you
As
explain that? What do you mean by traps? What kind of traps?
and well, I we repost a lot of work by Antonia Scatton, who is she's fantastic, and she's a linguistic person, and so she will say things like when we say Trump wants to take away your Social Security. That can be very problematic because people hear Trump and Social Security and they see that as a positive. They lose the language in the middle sometimes. So how you structure sentences and
Interesting.
how you so basically you want to make sure that there's a negative that goes anytime you use Trump's name. Otherwise, you run the risk of him taking credit for something that he's actually dismantling. That's just one small example, but it's
Fascinating.
full of that kind of stuff.
That's
So,
interesting.
yeah,
That's interesting. Wow. So your project is really to support writers who are trying to figure out how to create an alternative narrative to
yeah,
this kind of fascist narrative that's emerging. Is that
right.
correct?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, occasionally I'll post my own stuff, but most of the time I'm just cross posting pieces that are really, really useful and really smart on those terms. Or that are talking about some for example, I've reposted a lot of Michael's posts on moral injuries
Mm,
because that's something that more people need to be writing about. They need to be aware of it in their writing because it goes to all of these stories. Basically, it runs so deep into what's happening to this country right now, and people don't. They're not looking at all of these events from that psychological angle in terms of the harm that is being done to each of our psyches just
yes.
by living
Yes.
through this
Yes.
period,
Yes. Yes.
by feeling complicit, by not doing enough, by doing the wrong thing, by taking a job that turns out to be aiding and abetting the
Yes.
regime. I mean, I keep thinking of the people who sign up for ICE because they desperately need a job and they need to feed their family. And then they find out that their job is to go out and basically try and kill, peaceful protesters. Those people are going to suffer huge moral injuries. Mm,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
nobody's got any sympathy for them. But again,
That's
we're
right.
back to the whole thing about war and
That's
not
right.
having any sympathy for the Japanese on the other side who are in a terrible bind and are forced to do things that they know are morally wrong, but they really are surrounded and don't, you know. Sophie's Choice runs at every level
Exactly.
of these kinds of interactions.
an organization I'm involved with here in Tokyo is called the Women's Action Museum, which is a unbelievably amazing feminist project founded 20 years ago by just this phenomenal woman lawyer, Yaori Matsui, who uh, really decided that it was time for women to take the lead in dealing with the sexual violence that
Mm.
happened during World War II and that was perpetrated by Japanese soldiers
Okay.
upon Korean, Australian, Indonesian, and other women.
Chinese, yeah.
Chinese, yes, excuse me, absolutely,
Sure.
Chinese women, and also lower class Japanese
Yeah.
women. You know, I sort of cut my teeth in international law going with them. It was amazing. They connected all this. This will probably shock our younger listeners listening to this, but when I was in my 20s, there was a lot of sex tourism here in Asia where men from Japan and the US and elsewhere would go to Thailand on these
Has
sex
that
tours.
stopped? Isn't it still going?
Oh, it's still going on? Oh god,
Yeah,
that's
I
and we would
think
go
so.
to Narita Airport and meet them with, like, huge signs when they came back and sort of say, you know, like, "This is you should this you should aren't you ashamed of yourselves?" and take their pictures
Oh,
and all this kind of stuff, and those were and, we had so up to the power of fiction, Matsui organized a women's tribunal because there had been a war crimes tribunal after World War II,
mhm,
and it had all the evidence of what had happened to women.
yeah.
But the Allied Grand Poobahs just said that doesn't matter. Like that we're going to prosecute these guys for all the things they did to men, but we're just going to ignore what they did to women. And so, all these years later, you know, after also a lot of the so-called comfort women started coming out and telling their stories because they had been so ashamed in many cases to tell
Yeah.
what had happened to them that they didn't come out for many years. Uh, uh, this large fictional tribunal was organized in Tokyo, but it was not a real tribunal, but it copied in every minute detail how a real tribunal, even kind of going back in time and pretending exactly the day that it was in 1946, like, you know, only using the law that was available
Mm,
at that time, only using the technology that was available at that time to really show the path not taken, what was available, how justice could have been served at that moment. And the women came forward and told their stories, and there were very important feminist international lawyers as judges, and they produced this exquisitely argued legal opinion, which has now been used by real Supreme Courts in the Philippines and elsewhere as the basis for legal argumentation. So it's kind of become real
ah,
law. But you know, it was just a powerful example of how fiction can heal in some, you know, and fiction doesn't have to just be a text in a book. It can be
right.
an experience too, you know.
Well, it's
Um,
brilliant. I mean, certainly, movies do the same thing. I
yeah,
don't know, there's was a series, it started in Britain about, it was called Mr. Bates and the Post Office, and that's what blew open the crime of the British Post Office against the individual postmasters, which had been going on for over 20 years. They
yeah,
had been just destroying people's lives, accusing them of financial crimes that were all caused by their own computer mistakes. But the British Post Office would not admit that it made any mistakes, and it destroyed hundreds of people's lives. And until that story was told as a TV series, nobody was paying any attention to it, and that just blew it wide open.
yeah.
Yeah,
Well, I think this is why I always say culture leads and law follows. And this is why I think we need more stories, right? That this
yeah.
is the power that folks who are the creatives have at this moment, especially. And you know, if
Mm.
there's one thing we should have learned from Trump, it's that whew, does narrative have a lot of power,
Oh,
right?
absolutely.
Woo!
Yeah. And you're talking about the comfort women in that tribunal, and it's really fascinating because there are so many different ways to interpret these things, if you only have part of the picture. But I know from following the thread on what had been the tribunals that were done after the Andaman Islands, and I wrote a big long essay because I kind of went down the historical rabbit hole on that. But those tribunals were really cooked because the Cold War had started, and
Exactly.
the
And they
Japan was our allies, Germany was our allies. So the old ally, they had to really titrate those tribunals very carefully, and so a lot of horrific massacres that were done in the Pacific, they were never prosecuted. They never came up at tribunal, or if they came up at tribunal, it was some low level, corporal or something that was prosecuted. Never the generals, never the higher ups, never the people who were calling the shots. And certainly I can see that the shame involved in the comfort women crimes would have made that completely impossible for the
yeah,
Allies to do at that point because they're trying to curry favor with their Cold War partners.
exactly. Exactly.
So, and you're
And
right that fiction, literature, art creates at least initially creates the liberty, the freedom to bring all of that up to the light in ways that probably law doesn't, government doesn't, politics doesn't. Uh,
just want to say, I unfortunately, because of a glitch, I cannot see anyone who's joined or any comments. So if there are comments, Aimee, could you pull them up and just invite anyone if you have questions or comments
Sure. Sure.
to.
I see that some people have joined. I haven't seen
Oh,
any
yes, yes.
comments, but I can read them if you guys
Okay, if
have
you have
comments and want
questions,
to put in.
we'd
Yeah.
love to hear them. It's just that I can't. I'll rely on you.
Sure.
Uh, but yeah, I think the other thing that your work, not so much this book, but some of your essays on Substack that I've read really raised too, is the question of sort of secrets and how we deal with things that have happened in the past and how we come to terms with that. And that was a lot what we were talking about in terms of the Argentine case on our salon. And what do you do when everybody knows, or what you don't, yeah, the roles that all of that plays. I mean, this is not a personal secret because my husband has written about it, so I can talk about it. But we had this in our family where my husband is Japanese. He's a professor in the United States, and um, from the time that we met, I always knew that they were this very pro-American family. His father had been president, his grandfather had been president of the American Club after the war in Tokyo, and his grandfather had a PhD from Berkeley, and they had all been back and forth many times before the war, after the war, blah blah blah. And one day he was clearing out his attic, and he found this picture of sent to his mother when she was 3 or 4 from his father, and he's like this like cool guy with a cigarette, and like kind of like this, like against a fancy car. And the postcard is from Burma, and
Oh,
it says, "Dear Keiko, everything is fine here. I'm having such a good time. They put me in charge of the interrogations of the Americans. It'll all be over really soon. I'm having a blast."
oh boy. Ow.
And so realizing, but totally, the minute the war was over, he was on the other side and he was being used, and he probably was involved in CIA, and you know what I mean? Like all of it, like
Yeah.
everyone was on all sides of everything. And
Yeah.
that, I think, that is the painful, back to moral injury, the real pain of war is that you're forced to make compromises and to like doing it in a way that breaks you and that
Mhm.
you can't ever quite put back together again, and you can't share with others,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So
There are a lot of I've been reading a lot of essays about these kinds of things, sort
yes,
of the
yes,
the
yes.
stuff that comes out of the attic that
Yeah,
and what it
exactly.
reveals. Yeah, yeah. But I
Exactly.
know I know what you're talking about because my father's father, who was in the government of the Republican government in China for his whole adult life, he was forced to switch sides constantly to stay alive, basically.
Yes.
And it was like trying to stand on
Yeah.
quicksand
Yeah.
because
Yes.
the political field was constantly shifting. The
Yeah.
people in power, I mean, a
Yeah.
lot of a lot of the people that came up through the nationalist Chinese movement were big fans of Hitler and spent
Yeah.
a lot of time in Germany and came back with this, all this stuff. And some of them came through my grandfather's field. Some of them came through my father's field. I mean, I found this letter that was basically trying in coded language to warn my father about dealing with this guy who was a big buddy of Hitler and was actually passing through Los Angeles on his way to Germany to see his pal Hitler. And I could tell reading through the lines after the fact that my grandfather was absolutely terrified of this guy. He was
Interesting.
terrified of crossing him. He was terrified of my father crossing him. And my father was a 22-year-old
Yeah.
college kid who was working at the consulate. I'm sure he had no idea well, I'm not sure, but I suspect he had no idea what his father was talking about. But that
Yeah.
sense of,
Yeah.
just having to twist yourself like a pretzel in order to
Yeah.
survive and morally, where do you stand in something like that?
So have you been able to make sense of where your grandfather stood? I mean, what was the core for him, who what he really believed, or was there no such thing, do you think, in the
Oh,
end?
no, no, no. He was a true believer in democracy. He started, there's a wonderful piece that I have. He spent 2 days in Hong Kong with Yung Wing, who had started the American Chinese, kids coming to America to go to Yale. He was in charge of that in the late 1800s. And my grandfather wrote about everything that he learned about democracy and the Constitution and all of this stuff from Yung Wing. And I just have this image of the two of them in this hotel in 1895 or whenever it was. And then he came to Berkeley and he was all about overthrowing the monarchy and the dynasty in China. And, and he went back. He was the first senator from Wuhan in the first Republican Congress in China. I think what a lot of those guys had was they had that Chinese arrogance that
Mhm.
comes with being a classical scholar and trained and, the elite of the elite.
Yeah.
And I don't,
Interesting.
I believe just putting things together that he thought he'd come. America had done all the hard work of creating a democracy. He was going to learn from the Americans, take this back to China, and they were going to make democracy happen in China, and it'd be all be done. That first Congress would be great, and then of course it was just an endless slog through the warlord era and everything else. He was my grandfather was a close protege of Sun Yat-sen. So they were very, very tight. And he was there with him, a day before Son died. And so that was really, what percolated through the family was that he was a true, true believer in democracy and constitutional kind of government for China and all of that kind of stuff. And um, his side lost. Yeah.
So he was quite idealistic, would you say?
Oh, I think he was completely idealistic. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Amazing. I mean, and it's such an important history right now, given all that's happening. And of course, I don't hear Americans paying enough attention, in my view, to what's happening in Taiwan right now. That this is really a theater that is really critical, and everyone's got their attention elsewhere. And it's precisely at those moments that things could happen. You
Well,
know,
Trump showed them how to do it by
that,
attacking Iran and
and hopefully
Venezuela. I mean, if Trump can do it, why can't they?
and the sort of moral sanction is off the table because the U.S.
Okay.
has already done it. Also, at this moment, one thing people don't know is that the U.S. has a bunch of aircraft carriers that are actually paid for by Japan that are based here in the Pacific. Trump has moved them all to the Middle East,
Oh no.
which is really, first of all, unfair because they're paid for by Japan to
Yeah.
But so Japan, the one argument people in Japan are saying is, why is he asking us to finance this war? We already are financing it. He's using our aircraft carriers that we paid for. But this region is very undefended right now, and China is very aware of that. And they just had a bunch of tests, nuclear tests,
Mhm.
and missile tests in the Pacific. So
Right.
please, people, pay attention. And in this election cycle, as your candidates are coming around, ask them what is your position on this, because it's serious stuff. But anyway,
Yeah.
that's
The other thing that I would like everybody to do is
yeah,
pay attention to the Red Scare and the McCarthy era because it
yes,
is back in full
yes,
force and they are
yes,
using all those same tropes.
absolutely.
That we won't get into it here, but that basically destroyed my family, destroyed my father, and talk about generational damage that is completely under the radar and that nobody acknowledges. And I'm just beginning to understand just how harmful that was on a personal level with us. And then you multiply it times the millions of people that were persecuted during the Red Scare and beyond. There's just no end to it. And they want to bring back exactly that kind of all those scare tactics, all that demonization, all of that, dehumanizing people. American citizens, we're talking here. We are not talking immigrants anymore. We are talking about American citizens. But anybody who's not white and anybody who's not a MAGA Republican is in danger right now.
Communists. And yet,
Yeah.
it's so, I mean, being a college professor, talking to young people, I wonder if this will work. I mean, I find that they are so much smarter than we were as college students, and so much more like sort of suddenly mobilized and just angry, and also thinking about economic issues in ways that hasn't been on the radar much. I think because of the inequality in the society and how it impacts young people in particular. So I'm not even sure they think communism is a bad word, frankly.
Yeah. Well,
Some
it's
of,
never used correctly. So, I
yes,
mean, certainly Trump doesn't use it correctly. I mean, if anybody knows what it is, they're ahead of the ball game. So, yeah.
exactly, exactly. Well, we should stop
Yeah.
probably, but it's really just, Aimee, I'm just so grateful to know you. I adore what you do,
Likewise.
and hope we can find more ways to collaborate in the future. And would love to find ways to continue the conversation
Oh,
with you.
absolutely. It's a real honor, Annalise, and I'm in awe of you. I feel like such a piker,
Vice
but
versa, vice versa.
yeah.
Wonderful. All right. Well, take care. And everybody, thank you for joining us. And if you're listening to this after the fact and you have comments, we'd love to continue the conversation with you
We'll
online
post the
as
video tomorrow or so,
well.
probably. Yeah.
Okay, take care. Bye, Aimee.
Thank
Have a good
you.
evening. Bye.
Bye.